You think it's age, money, or experience that draws her in. But what if I told you the very habits you rely on are silently turning her away, killing attraction before it even has a chance to grow? And the worst part is, you don't even realize you're doing it until she's already emotionally gone and physically distant, leaving you confused, frustrated, and questioning what went wrong. Attraction between an older man and a younger woman is not built on what most men assume, and this is where the first deep mistake begins to take root, because many older men walk into these connections believing their life experience automatically places them in a position of authority, subtly turning conversations into lectures instead of exchanges, and what feels like wisdom to him often feels like control or condescension to her, creating a silent emotional gap that grows wider with every interaction. Because attraction thrives on emotional equality, not hierarchy. And when she feels like she's being managed instead of understood, her natural curiosity begins to fade. There is a delicate psychological dance happening beneath the surface, one where she is not just responding to what you say, but how you make her feel about herself in your presence. And when your tone carries even a hint of superiority, it slowly chips away at the emotional safety she needs to feel open, playful, and connected. Another subtle but powerful mistake comes from overcompensation, where an older man tries too hard to prove he still belongs in her world, adopting trends, slang, or behaviors that don't align with who he truly is. And while the intention is to appear relatable, the result often feels forced, creating a disconnect that she can sense, even if she cannot immediately explain it, because authenticity is far more attractive than imitation. And the moment you step out of your natural identity, you create friction that disrupts the organic flow of attraction. She is not looking for a younger version of a man. She is drawn to presence, confidence, and grounded energy. And when you abandon that in an attempt to fit into her world, you unintentionally lose the very qualities that made you intriguing in the first place. There is also a deeply emotional layer to this dynamic that many men overlook, and that is the importance of emotional availability. Because while physical attraction might spark the initial connection, it is emotional depth that sustains it. And when an older man carries unresolved baggage, guarded communication, or avoids vulnerability, it creates a wall that she cannot penetrate, leaving her feeling disconnected even when she is physically close. Younger women, despite stereotypes, often crave emotional resonance, someone who can hold space for their thoughts, their ambitions, their fears, and when that space is absent, attraction begins to weaken, not suddenly, but gradually, like a slow fade that becomes noticeable only when it is almost gone. Another critical mistake lies in misunderstanding desire itself, assuming that attraction is purely physical or transactional, when in reality it is deeply psychological, shaped by how she feels in your presence, how seen she feels, how alive she feels when she's around you, and when interactions become predictable, routine, or overly focused on outcomes, the sense of excitement begins to diminish. Because attraction feeds on emotional stimulation, curiosity, and the unknown, and when those elements are missing, even the strongest initial spark can fade into indifference. Control is another silent killer that often goes unnoticed, where an older man tries to lead every aspect of the interaction, believing it demonstrates strength. But in reality, it can suffocate the natural flow of connection, because true attraction is not about control. It is about co-creation, allowing moments to unfold organically, giving her space to express herself, to challenge you, to bring her own energy into the dynamic. And when that space is restricted, the connection loses its depth and becomes one-dimensional. There is also the mistake of emotional detachment, disguised as composure, where a man believes that showing less emotion makes him appear more attractive, more mysterious, more in control. But what it often does is create distance, making her feel like she is engaging with a wall rather than a person. And while a certain level of calmness is attractive, complete emotional withdrawal creates confusion and disconnect, because she cannot build a bond with someone who does not reveal themselves. Another layer to this is the tendency to rely too heavily on material displays, believing that providing experiences, gifts, or financial stability will compensate for emotional gaps. But while these things can enhance a connection, they cannot replace genuine emotional engagement. And when they are used as substitutes, they often create an imbalance where the connection feels transactional rather than authentic, leading to a loss of genuine attraction over time. Communication style also plays a critical role, and one of the most damaging mistakes is failing to truly listen. Not just hearing words, but understanding meaning, emotion, and intent. Because when she feels unheard, even in small moments, it creates a sense of invisibility that erodes attraction. And this often happens subtly, through interruptions, dismissive responses, or redirecting conversations back to oneself. Behaviors that may seem insignificant but accumulate over time into a larger emotional disconnect. Then there is the issue of emotional pacing, where an older man either moves too quickly, overwhelming her with intensity, or too slowly, creating stagnation, and both extremes disrupt the natural rhythm of attraction, because connection requires a balance between momentum and space, allowing feelings to develop without pressure while still maintaining a sense of progression that keeps the dynamic alive. Underneath all of these mistakes lies a deeper truth that many fail to recognize, and that is attraction is not something you convince someone into feeling. It is something that emerges naturally when the emotional environment is right, when she feels seen, valued, challenged, and free all at once. And when any of those elements are missing or distorted, attraction begins to weaken, often without clear explanation, leaving both sides confused about what changed. And perhaps the most dangerous aspect of these mistakes is how invisible they are to the person making them. Because from his perspective, he is doing everything right, bringing experience, stability, and effort into the connection. Yet from her perspective, something feels off. Something she cannot fully articulate but can deeply feel. And that feeling is what ultimately determines whether attraction grows or fades. Because attraction is not logical. It is emotional, intuitive, and deeply tied to the subtle dynamics of human interaction that cannot be forced or faked. And what makes this even more complex is that attraction doesn't collapse all at once. It erodes quietly beneath the surface while everything appears normal on the outside. And this is where the next layer of mistakes becomes even more dangerous, because they are rooted not in obvious behavior, but in subtle emotional patterns that shape how she experiences you over time, starting with the tendency to become predictable. Because while stability is comforting, predictability in attraction is suffocating, and many older men fall into routines that feel safe to them, but slowly drain the emotional excitement from the connection. repeating the same conversations, the same gestures, the same energy, until she no longer feels the spark of discovery that initially drew her in. Because attraction thrives on contrast, on moments that surprise, challenge, and stimulate her mind and emotions in ways she cannot fully anticipate. And when everything becomes known and expected, the emotional intensity fades into familiarity, and familiarity without emotional depth leads to disinterest. This predictability often comes from a place of control, a desire to manage outcomes and avoid uncertainty. But attraction is inherently uncertain. It lives in the space between knowing and not knowing, between comfort and tension. And when you remove that tension entirely, you remove the very force that keeps her engaged. And this is why some men, despite having everything on paper, fail to sustain attraction, because they create an environment that feels emotionally flat rather than dynamically alive. Another deeply overlooked mistake is the inability to create emotional polarity, the subtle push and pull that keeps energy flowing between two people. Because when a man is either too accommodating or too distant, he disrupts this balance, and many older men lean toward over-accommodation, believing that being consistently agreeable will make her feel secure and appreciated. But what it often does is remove the sense of challenge and intrigue that fuels attraction, because desire is not built on constant agreement. It is built on emotional contrast, on moments where she feels both understood and slightly unsettled, drawn in yet curious. And when everything feels easy and predictable, the emotional charge begins to dissipate. On the other side, some men overcorrect and become emotionally unavailable, thinking that distance creates desire, but without a foundation of genuine connection, distance only creates confusion and detachment. And this imbalance leaves her unsure of where she stands, not in a way that excites her, but in a way that exhausts her, because there is a difference between mystery and inconsistency. And when she cannot rely on your emotional presence, attraction turns into frustration. There is also a powerful psychological element tied to validation, where many older men either overgive or completely withhold it. And both extremes are equally damaging. Because when you constantly validate without discernment, your words lose meaning, becoming background noise rather than something she values. And when you withhold validation entirely, she begins to feel unseen and unappreciated. And attraction requires a balance where validation feels earned, genuine, and aligned with her actions and energy, not given freely without thought or withheld as a form of control. This balance creates a dynamic where she feels both recognized and motivated, engaged in the interaction rather than passively receiving attention. Another mistake that often goes unnoticed is the failure to evolve within the connection. Because many men rely on the same version of themselves that initially created attraction, assuming it will continue to sustain it. But attraction is not static. It requires growth, adaptation, and emotional expansion. And when she begins to grow, explore new ideas, or shift her perspective and you remain unchanged, the gap between you widens, not necessarily in age, but in emotional and intellectual alignment. And over time, this misalignment reduces the depth of connection, making the relationship feel less engaging and more stagnant. There is also the issue of emotional intensity, where some men mistake intensity for depth, overwhelming her with heavy conversations, constant attention, or an accelerated emotional pace that feels more like pressure than connection. And while intensity can create temporary excitement, it is not sustainable. Because true attraction develops through a balance of intensity and lightness, depth and playfulness, seriousness and ease. And when one dominates the other, the connection becomes unbalanced, leading to emotional fatigue rather than desire. At the same time, avoiding intensity altogether creates a shallow dynamic that lacks emotional substance, leaving her feeling unfulfilled, even if everything appears smooth on the surface, because without moments of depth, vulnerability, and genuine emotional exchange, the connection never fully develops into something meaningful. One of the most subtle yet impactful mistakes is the inability to read her emotional cues. The small shifts in tone, energy, and engagement that signal how she is experiencing the interaction. Because attraction is not just about what you express, but how well you respond to what she expresses. And when you miss these cues, responding in ways that feel out of sync with her emotional state, it creates friction that disrupts the natural flow of connection, making interactions feel forced or disconnected. And over time, this misalignment accumulates, weakening attraction even if individual moments seem insignificant. There is also a deeper layer related to self-perception, because how you see yourself directly influences how she experiences you. And many older men carry hidden insecurities about age, relevance, or desirability. And while they may not express these insecurities directly, they manifest in subtle behaviors, overcompensation, need for reassurance, or defensiveness, all of which create an undercurrent of instability that she can feel. Because attraction is deeply tied to emotional certainty, not in the sense of predictability, but in the sense of grounded confidence. And when that foundation is shaky, it affects the entire dynamic. Another critical mistake is neglecting the importance of shared experiences that create emotional memory, because attraction is not just built in conversation. It is strengthened through moments that evoke feeling, excitement, and connection. And when interactions remain confined to predictable settings or repetitive patterns, the relationship lacks the emotional imprint that deepens attraction over time. And this is where many connections lose momentum, not because of a lack of interest, but because of a lack of emotionally engaging experiences that keep the connection evolving. Underneath all of these patterns lies a fundamental truth that many fail to fully grasp, and that is attraction is a living process, something that must be nurtured, adjusted, and understood at a deeper level, not controlled or assumed. And when you approach it with rigid expectations or fixed strategies, you limit its ability to grow naturally, creating resistance where there should be flow, and tension where there should be connection. And as these mistakes compound, they create a subtle but undeniable shift in how she feels. A shift that is rarely communicated directly, because attraction does not always announce its departure. It simply fades, leaving behind confusion and unanswered questions. And by the time it becomes obvious, the emotional distance has already formed, making it much harder to rebuild what was lost. And by the time most men realize something has changed, they are already reacting instead of leading, trying to fix a loss of attraction with the same behaviors that quietly caused it in the first place, which only deepens the disconnect. Because attraction cannot be negotiated back into existence through effort alone. It must be rebuilt through awareness, presence, and a complete shift in how you engage with her emotionally, psychologically, and energetically. And this is where the final layer reveals itself. Because the most damaging mistake is not any single behavior, but the failure to understand that attraction is a reflection of the emotional experience you create, not the traits you possess. When a man begins to sense distance, he often increases his effort in visible ways. More messages, more attention, more attempts to impress, believing that doing more will restore what is fading. But this often overwhelms her and removes the space necessary for attraction to breathe, because desire needs room to grow. And when you fill every gap with effort, you eliminate the anticipation, the curiosity, and the emotional tension that keeps her engaged, turning what could have been intrigue into pressure. At the same time, some men respond in the opposite direction, pulling away abruptly in an attempt to regain control. But when this shift is driven by fear rather than grounded confidence, it feels inconsistent and confusing, creating emotional instability rather than renewed attraction. Because she is not responding to the action itself. She is responding to the intention behind it. And intention is something she senses even when it is not spoken. This is why self-awareness becomes the most powerful tool, because without it, every adjustment you make is reactive rather than intentional, and reaction is always one step behind what is actually happening in the connection. Another critical realization is that attraction is deeply tied to emotional leadership. Not in the sense of dominance or control, but in the ability to create an environment where she feels both safe and stimulated, where there is clarity without rigidity and freedom without chaos. And this balance requires a level of emotional intelligence that goes beyond surface-level interaction. It requires you to be fully present, to notice shifts in energy, to adapt without losing your core, and to engage in a way that feels both grounded and dynamic at the same time. When this balance is missing, the connection either becomes too rigid, suffocating her sense of individuality, or too loose, lacking the structure needed to build trust. And in both cases, attraction struggles to sustain itself because it relies on both security and excitement existing simultaneously. There is also a deeper layer of truth that many avoid confronting, and that is attraction cannot be maintained if you are disconnected from yourself. Because the way you show up in any connection is a direct reflection of your internal state. And if you are seeking validation, avoiding vulnerability, or operating from insecurity, those patterns will shape every interaction, no matter how much you try to mask them, and she will feel it. Not necessarily in a conscious way, but in the subtle emotional signals that influence how she responds to you over time. This is why the most effective shift is not in tactics, but in internal alignment. Becoming someone who is genuinely grounded, emotionally aware, and comfortable with both connection and uncertainty. Because attraction is not about eliminating uncertainty. It is about navigating it with confidence and presence. Another essential aspect is understanding that younger women are not drawn to perfection. They are drawn to emotional experience, to how you make them feel in ways that go beyond logic. And when you focus too heavily on presenting a flawless image, you remove the human element that creates connection. Because perfection is distant, but authenticity is engaging. And it is within authenticity that attraction finds space to grow and evolve. This also means allowing yourself to be seen, not in a way that seeks sympathy or approval, but in a way that creates genuine connection, where she can experience you as a real person rather than an idealized version. because it is in that realness that emotional bonds are formed. There is also a powerful shift that happens when you move from trying to maintain attraction to naturally embodying the qualities that create it. Because when you are no longer focused on the outcome, your interactions become more fluid, more present, and less constrained by expectation. And this freedom allows attraction to develop in a way that feels effortless rather than forced, because you are no longer chasing a reaction, you are creating an experience. At the same time, it is important to recognize that not every connection is meant to sustain long-term attraction. And part of emotional maturity is understanding when a dynamic is no longer aligned, rather than trying to force it back into something it was. Because attraction is not only about what you do, but about compatibility, timing, and shared emotional direction. And when those elements are not aligned, no amount of adjustment can fully compensate for that gap. And this is where clarity becomes essential, not just in how you engage with her, but in how you understand yourself, your intentions, your values, and what you are truly seeking in the connection. Because without that clarity, you are navigating based on reaction rather than purpose. And purpose is what creates consistency, direction, and emotional stability within the dynamic. When you bring all of this together, the mistakes that once felt confusing begin to make sense. Because you start to see attraction not as something mysterious or unpredictable, but as something deeply connected to emotional awareness, authenticity, and the quality of the experience you create. And this shift in understanding changes everything, because instead of trying to fix isolated behaviors, you begin to transform the way you show up entirely. And in that transformation, attraction is no longer something you struggle to maintain. It becomes something that naturally grows from the connection you build, the presence you bring, and the emotional environment you create, where she feels seen, engaged, and free all at once. Because at its core, attraction is not about age, status, or strategy. It is about how deeply you understand the human experience of connection, and how intentionally you choose to engage with it, moment by moment, interaction by interaction, without forcing, without controlling, and without losing yourself in the process. And when you reach that level of awareness, you no longer need to chase attraction, because you become the kind of presence that naturally inspires it.